On this week's 51%, we hear from Syracuse University professor and columnist Jenn M. Jackson about their new book, What Black Women Taught Us, celebrating the legacy of Black women leaders and their contribution to America's modern civil rights movements.
We gained so much because these women loved us enough to fight and persevere despite the world ignoring them.
I'm Jessie King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jessie King. February is Black History Month, and I thought to start the month off, we'd bring you a conversation with writer and researcher Jenn M. Jackson. Jackson recently spoke with WAMC's Sarah LeDuc about their new book, What Black Women Taught Us, An Intimate History of Black Feminism. Jackson is an award-winning professor of political science at Syracuse University, where their research has focused on Black politics with an emphasis on Black feminism, racial threat and trauma, gender and sexuality, social movements, and more. When they're not teaching, researching, or writing books, they also co-host the podcast That Black Couple and have their own column with Teen Vogue called Speak On It, exploring how today's social and political climate is shaped by generations of racism and gender norms. What Black Women Taught Us reflects on the legacy of Black women writers and leaders like Zora Neale Hurston, Toni Morrison, and Ida B. Wells. Jackson examines how their activism fueled America's social movements and how their efforts have consistently been misrepresented or erased. Entwined with their histories, Jackson also includes stories about the women in their own life and the lessons they learned growing up as a queer, gender-flux, androgynous Black woman.
The book poses the question, why has Black women's freedom fighting been overlooked throughout history, and what has our society lost because of our refusal to engage with our four strugglers' lessons? I would like to take that question in two parts and ask you the first part first. Why? The first part is why.
I want to start with a story that actually opens the book, talking about, Wednesday nights at my home,
Yes.
growing up in Oakland, California with my mother and my aunts. I grew up in East Oakland, California, and it was in the 90s, in a time where, it wasn't a really safe place for a little Black queer girl. My home was a site of respite and safety for me at all times. And so people would frequently come into the home and we'd have these kind of moments of fellowship. So I opened the book talking about one of these particular evenings when my mom's singing group, it was called Majesty, would come over and they would, they sang a cappella, they sang with the piano, they sang in these beautiful kind of 5 and 6 part harmonies. And me being this child who frequently was afraid of going outside, was afraid of being in these public spaces, that's where I learned so many lessons about how to person, about how to grow into an adult, to grow into a Black woman. I start off talking about my aunt, Donna Faye, who is actually not blood relation. She is a woman who helped raise me at my church, Evergreen Missionary Baptist Church. And we always joke that I was almost born in the choir stand. My auntie Barbara, also no blood relation, was there, and she taught me about how to cook chicken properly. The reason why I start here and to answer your question is because I really fundamentally believe that the reason why so many of these lessons and these four strugglers and our foremothers have been intentionally erased and misremembered is because these experiences outside of Black communities, they look inconsequential. They look as though they are unimportant or unvaluable. And for me, it took me growing into an adult to understand how critical those lessons were with those Black women in my home who were telling me about how this world would treat my body, how they would receive me, how I would have to navigate society against kind of an anti-Black, misogynistic, white supremacist veil. And I argue throughout the book that it was those early lessons that took me through the journey that made this book what it was, that pushed me to keep finding these women, the Zora Neale Hurstons, the Toni Morrisons, the Audre Lordes, the Bell Hooks, to keep answering questions about what my mother and my aunts presented to me in that house on those Wednesday evenings.
What has society lost in not engaging with the stories more? What do you think? I mean, speculative. We are living in the reality we are living in, and I won't say for better or for worse. I will say for worse.
Absolutely.
So, what do you think if you I guess fantasize about if things had been different, or you could flip a switch and make them different? What would society gain? Where would we be that would be better?
This is a complicated question for me, because I think that in a lot of ways, when we say society, we're talking about the mainstream kind of white world in the
Right.
United States,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I think that for me, society is very complex. I find that in recounting these stories and coming back to the foot of my mother's bed and writing this book, and remembering the first time I picked up a book from Alice Walker, the first time I read Terry McMillan, and bringing that into this project, I think that actually society hasn't lost anything, right? I think that these women, we're lucky, right? We're lucky that women like Zora Neale Hurston continue to write and to labor even against a world that told her that her writing was not important in her life, and that she died this awful death. She died of malnutrition and had this life of poverty, and her life or her work was resurrected by Alice Walker. So we actually never lost Hurston.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that in a lot of ways, the mainstream white world has lost so much. But luckily enough, Black women continue to teach anyway. Black women continued to write, continued to struggle, continued to theorize about their lives, even though mainstream society wasn't paying attention and didn't think it was valuable enough to be included in the archive. So I don't think that there's a way to turn back the time, and bring these folks into mainstream society in a way that wouldn't fundamentally change who these women were. I
Yeah.
think that who they were, who Fannie Lou Hamer was, right? Fannie Lou Hamer was a person who, part of her struggle was the fact that she was facing this ongoing erasure. Part of the reason why she did the work she did to ensure that folks in the South had the right to vote, that poor folks had a voice, was because she had constantly come up against the obstacles of being an unrespectable Black woman. So these lessons are born of struggle. And we gained so much because these women loved us enough to fight and persevere despite the world ignoring them.
The book is historical lessons about these women, and also, I would say, memoir. You tell a lot of your personal stories. You share a lot of your personal experience. When you imagined writing the book, was that always going to be the blend, the history and the you?
I love this question because I have to be honest and say I had a hard time imagining writing the book, because there's a part of me that also took my story for granted, right? There was a part of me that also didn't know that I had a story to tell. Those experiences, the experience of me, at choir rehearsal, the experience I had at Disney, as a young Black girl trying to navigate this predominantly white corporate America environment, those experiences I had tucked away for the most part when I came to this project. And it was in conversation with my editor. And she said, those things matter. What was happening was I was writing about them at Teen Vogue, and then I would go into my classroom, and in academia, we're supposed to leave those things at the door. But I realized in talking with my students, who I also I love my students so much, and I love teaching, and I learn so much from them. That's why they come up so often in the text. My students were coming to me and saying, Dr. Jenn, we not only need you as an educator and as a mentor in this class, but the way that you live your life the alignment between who you are as a queer, androgynous lesbian and a lover of all Black people, and how you do that in the real world is so critical to us. We need to understand that better. And that's where it came in to the book, where I realized that my Black girlhood, my complicated queer Black girlhood, was a part of this story too. The way that I was going to church and feeling confused about these older men kissing me on my cheek, and I could feel their wet saliva left on my body, and how uncomfortable that made me, being forced to wear these uncomfortable dress shoes and tights when I was still asking myself if I was even a girl.
Hmm.
Those were things that I was grappling with. And as I was reading Ida B. Wells and thinking about truth telling, I said, wait, I've done this before. I've struggled with truth telling. So that's where it came in, because these stories, these lessons are not just theory. I tell my students all the time, they are theory and they are practice. That's called praxis. And this book is about praxis. It's about thinking about the ways these Black women told us and taught us these lessons, but they also lived it. And that's what I'm doing too. That's why I'm in the book.
One of the things that you talk about in the book, I suppose like a metaphor for experience, is Melissa Perry Harris's Crooked Room.
That's right.
For people who mayn't be familiar, explain that metaphor and what it means and how it applies to the stories you're telling in the book.
Absolutely. I came out of Oakland and I went to the University of Southern California. I was an engineering major, and I had come out of this experience, like I told you earlier, being kind of very afraid of outside. My mother, did the best she could as a single mom, and her kind of response was to keep me in the home, to keep me safe. So when it was time to go to college, I was encountering, all of these new people and new environments for the first time. I had not been in a predominantly white environment before. And so I was encountering folks, who were calling me names and slurs on the street. I was encountering people who, when I walked into the room, the first thing they noticed was my Blackness. And it was confusing for me. And so I called my mother and I said, Mom, what were all those books I was reading at the foot of your bed? And she gave me a list. she she said, oh, you were reading Alice Walker. And I said, yes. And she said, oh, you read this from Toni Morrison and you read that. And I made a list on a little sticky note. And at the time, I went into what was Borders bookstore. I scoured all the shelves and I was like, I'm going to buy every book. And the one that stood out to me was Melissa Harris Perry's Sister Citizen. It was a very dark colored book, and the cover had a Black woman, and on her bald head was the American flag. And I said, oh my goodness, what's in this book? And when I opened it and began reading, she opened the text talking about the ways that Black women encounter stereotypes about their bodies, the sapphire, the mammy, the Jezebel. And this is the angry Black woman, the Black woman who is sexually lascivious, and the mammy who is asexual and just wants to care for the white family. And I said to myself, wow, first of all, I'd never heard of this before, right? I'm an engineer.
Mhm.
We don't take social science courses. So I was like, this is incredible. But what really got me was when she began talking about this concept of the crooked room. And she said that for Black women, we enter a crooked room each time we have to fit ourselves into these stereotypes and fit ourselves into these ways of being that are not natural or authentic, so that we can cope in a society that does not actually want us there. And I was sitting in Borders and I'm like, wow, I'm going to just sit here, start crying in the aisles of Borders.
Mhm.
And I bought that book and I read that book, and I talk about this in the introduction. I read that book so many times and I highlighted and I took notes, and I went to the footnotes and I went to the index and I went to the glossary, and I just drank up everything. And I said, the next thing I need to do is figure out every single woman she talks about in this book and read every single thing that they've written. And I treated her citations like a yellow brick road. And I followed every single author. And that's how I discovered Bell Hooks. The next book I read was Feminism is for Everyone. And I got that from Melissa Harris Perry. So that's, the Crooked Room actually was kind of the earliest part of my awakening and my politicization as a young Black woman, understanding myself and identifying myself in broader society.
So I have an idea that after the next question I ask you, the next thing I ask you to describe, that we will tie it together with the Crooked Room and hopefully land on explaining sort of where you are now and how you're trying to exist in the world now. Let me see. Let me see if I can do it.
Okay.
I want to talk about the weathering hypothesis.
Yes. One of the things I really wanted to bring in the book, I didn't want this just to be like a history textbook. I wanted to talk about not only the fact that there are so many Black women who have labored in movements, in communities, in churches, in households in our history, but that laboring has an effect on Black women's bodies and on their survivance. So for me, that took me to the weathering hypothesis, which comes from Dr. Geronimus, who actually wrote a new book on weathering that just came out last year. And the weathering hypothesis talks about the ways that Black women in particular navigate anti-Black systemic racism in the world, and how although there may not be any kind of surface evidence, right, of those encounters, people always say Black don't crack, right? And they're frequently talking about Black women. They're always talking about Angela Bassett and saying she ages in reverse, right?
Yeah.
And she's stunningly beautiful, right? These women will say they're 60 and they look 14, right? So, that was something that was interesting to me. But this hypothesis says actually what's happening is that the aging and the weathering is happening on the inside. So this is why so many Black women have very high rates of cancer diagnoses and heart conditions and diabetes and all of these kind of very preventable ailments that are frequently exacerbated among Black women because of the types of encounters and experiences they have in society, with longer work hours, less pay, communities that demand labor and rely on them for labor that is unpaid after work. And so in the book, I talk about this in the case of a number of the folks in the reading, but in particular, who's coming to mind right now is Audre Lorde. And in the case of Audre Lorde, I bring her into the text not just to talk about what most people talk about, which is the kind of self-care movement that started about, 5 to 10 years ago. People found her quote about radical self-care and they kind of left it there. But what they didn't realize was that Audre was writing at a time when she was fighting cancer and she was facing her own mortality. So she was writing from a place of saying, I have been struggling on behalf of my community for so many years. And now here I am in the quietness of my illness. I'm in the quietness of this disability. And just to remind folks, Audre had already encountered disability in her life growing up as a child with having low vision. And this is something I also relate to as a person who has Marfan syndrome and is also low vision. So with Audre in particular, she's writing about self-care, but unfortunately, she's writing about self-care after having already been so extracted from and been so tired and beat down by a world and society that did not respect her labor and did not respect her body. So I bring this thread throughout the entire book to argue that we are all guilty in some way of this, right? Even when we talk about folks like Oprah Winfrey and Kamala Harris and Stacey Abrams and Michelle Obama, and how people look to them to be these superheroines who will save the world from the problems we've created, right? This is how weathering happens, when we put the burdens of the world on Black women, but we don't actually give the scaffolding needed to care for those same Black women.
I think you already did it in that answer, the connection, because the scaffolding specifically is such a perfect word, because you have to, unfortunately, walk into the crooked rooms, face the weathering.
That's
and
right.
We haven't even mentioned, as part of that weathering, the constant stress that Black women have to feel worrying that they're about their kids going out into the world,
That's
especially
right.
with kids getting killed by cops and others,
That's
racists
right.
and cops all the time.
That's right.
It's too much. It's too heavy, but you're not defeated. You're
No.
trying to educate, and you are living a life raising your kids.
Mhm.
How did you find that? How do you do it?
Mm. That's a wonderful question. I'm deeply gratified by my grandmothers. I end the book talking about my grandmother, Lucille, who she passed away as I was writing the kind of final draft of this book.
I'm sorry.
And yes, thank you. She's always with me.
Mm-hmm.
And my grandmother, she told me when I was much younger, 11 years old. This is also in the book. She said to me, people like us, we move through the world and we're lonely. You're going to be very lonely. She said, so you find your people and you let them love you and you love them right back. And that's one of the earliest things she told me. And I remember at 11 being like, gosh, Grandma, tell me I'm going to be lonely. That's awful.
Yeah.
Like,
So there's no chance for happiness, you're saying. Okay,
right. I
cool.
was like, thanks, Grandma. But she was incredibly accurate. She was so accurate. What she was trying to explain to me is that, loving as a Black woman, right, especially as a Black queer disabled woman, loving this world, you're constantly in a state of violence with yourself, right? Because you want to offer grace to others to learn. You want to offer space to others to learn. This is what that last chapter is about. My conclusion is where I offered myself patience because I had a lot of guilt with myself that I didn't recognize the labor of these women earlier, that I didn't recognize the value of my grandmothers earlier, and I had to offer myself grace because I didn't feel that I stood up for them in the ways that I should have. And I think the answer to your question, how do I do that, is that I got that lesson from my grandmother so early. I've always been a loving person, and I deeply love Black people. And I believe that we will be in the future. I believe in a future where Black folk are outside of prisons and are not looking down the barrel of police guns. I believe that there are futures where we still have a Black Wall Street, and it's not plagued by racial pogroms and the KKK, right? I believe that it's possible for Black people to exist outside of these institutions and these systems and these organizations that seek to annihilate us. I fundamentally believe in us, and I fundamentally believe in our future. And the reason why is because I'm sitting here, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm turning 40 this year.
It's a good
As a
age.
Black,
I'm
it
wrapping
is.
up 40. I'm wrapping up 40.
I'm really excited about it.
Yeah.
The only thing I'm not excited about is the hot flashes. I
Right.
could
No.
do
Oh
without
my
the hot
gosh.
flashes.
I can't believe you just said that, because I was about to say, and this is the third interview in the last few months where it's come up without me really trying to do it. But I feel like I arrived in my body at 40 and
Yep.
then started looking online. I mean, online started showing me, I wasn't looking for it, that perimenopause is just going to bop right in and unsettle me again any second now.
They don't tell you that at like 32,
Yeah.
but here you are at 40. But I say that because, as a Black person of trans experience, I was assigned female at birth, but I grew up in this gender complicated body. I was 6'4" at 13 years old. And I have a 12-year-old daughter who is now 6'2",
Wow.
so this is the byproduct of Marfan syndrome, right? So, but it's very rare among Black people. So I stood out in a family of very small, petite women my mother is 5'5" and she's tall in my family.
Wow.
So for me, I was in this body that was hyper visible. I couldn't hide. I couldn't shrink even when I tried. And I was constantly afraid of how people, especially men, would engage with my body because I was a child. And in high school, in my adolescence, I encountered a great deal of trauma because of the ways that people read my body and how the world receives Black queer girls. And for me, at 16, I kept thinking, I just hope I can get to 18. And at 18, I said, I hope I can get to 20, you know?
Mhm.
And every couple of years, I would just say, I just hope I can get to the next big number. And now here I am at 40. And for me, that's the future. You know, like I'm realizing that I'm in the future now. The chapter I wrote on Ella Baker, I had learned like, oh wait, it's me now. You know, young people are looking to me now for mentorship and for guidance and to help them to get to a place where they can look at 40 and beyond. And I have to believe, right? If I'm going to be writing this work, if I'm going to be teaching this work, I have to believe that we have a future. I have to believe that there is more to us than just the annihilation. And that's where it comes from. I'm living it. So I have to believe it.
That was Dr. Jenn M. Jackson, author of What Black Women Taught Us, An Intimate History of Black Feminism, speaking with WAMC's Sarah LeDuc. Jackson is an assistant professor of political science at Syracuse University, whose research is in Black politics, with a focus on racial threat and trauma, gender and sexuality, and social movements. They also write a column for Teen Vogue, co-host a podcast called That Black Couple, and co-run Colored Combos Media, a company elevating the work of Black and queer creators. Their new book is published by Random House, and you can find it at most major booksellers. To learn more about Jenn, you can check out their website, jennmjackson.com. One quick tidbit before we go about a Syracuse, New York native ready to literally reach for the stars. Dr. Jenn M is preparing to launch with NASA's Crew 8 mission to the International Space Station later this month. Her 6-month stay, courtesy of a SpaceX Dragon spacecraft and a new Falcon 9 booster, will be part of a long-term rotational mission aimed at helping NASA better understand long-duration spaceflight, as it hopes to one day bring the first woman and person of color to the moon and even prepare for human missions to Mars. Epps recently spoke with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer ahead of her trip. She says Crew 8 will take the reins from Crew 7 and contribute to more than 200 scientific experiments and technological demonstrations aboard the ISS, studying everything from the impact of microgravity and UV radiation on plant cells to whether wearing pressure cuffs can help astronauts avoid certain health issues.
Being patient with ourselves is going to be the most important thing, because when we go to space, we're going to have to adapt to that environment and then really start rolling up our sleeves and doing the work at the space station.
NASA says this will be Epps' first space flight. With Crew 8, Epps will become just the second Black woman to be part of an ISS crew, behind Jessica Watkins in 2022. NASA says Epps will specifically serve as a mission specialist, helping pilot Michael Barrett monitor the Dragon spacecraft during takeoff and re-entry. While she has a long career as a researcher and engineer, working for organizations like Ford and the CIA, Epps says she never grew up thinking she'd become an astronaut, per se. She hopes her trip will encourage young girls to chase their own ambitions.
Putting in the time and effort, you can learn anything. Everything is hard until you learn it. But once you get involved and you start just doing things and going forward and following your passion, I think they'll go very, very far. You never know where you'll end up. You may end up on the space station or on the moon or maybe even eventually Mars.
NASA and SpaceX say Crew 8 will launch from Kennedy Space Center in Florida no earlier than February 22nd. Thanks for listening to this week's 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King. Our associate producer is Jody Cowan, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at WAMCpodcasts.org or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can stay in the loop on all of WAMC shows by signing up for our weekly newsletter Airwaves at WAMC.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King, 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. At night, down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool, no electricity, hot rain on the concrete, sweet melting little girl dreams. They said, oh, I want a big life, not a house I could have been like. Where are you taking me? Where are you taking me? Said everything I do, I feel fine.